As technologies and geopolitics change, so does the nature of warfare. Welcome back to On Future War, a series sponsored by Cubic Defense that looks at emerging technologies and how they may affect peer and near-peer level conflict in the future, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, with a specific focus on military tactics, operations, and strategy, and their interaction with the other instruments of national security policy. The future is now.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Welcome back to On Future War. Today we're talking with Daniel Marujo, President and Managing Director of Trusted Strategic Solutions, and today's topic is computer chip vulnerabilities. To set the stage for today's discussion, we've already talked about tactics and operations in the first phase of the series, and weapon systems and logistics in the second. Now we're starting to close out the series with discussions on technology, starting here today with computer chips, or more accurately, microelectronics. This is obviously an enormous topic, and we will only be scratching the surface, but I believe Daniel's knowledge and insight will greatly illustrate and illuminate some of the key concerns and vulnerabilities to the U.S., particularly if engaged in peer-level conflict with China, with, to, and through microelectronics. Today, on Future War. This is Authentic. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Authentic and another episode of On Future War. I'm your host, Scott Roger Chafian, and today our guest is Daniel Marujo, President and Managing Director of Trusted Strategic Solutions, and we're here to talk about computer chip vulnerabilities as they relate to the defense sector, and as always in On Future War, how this could relate to potential peer-level conflict in the Indo-PACOM region. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on here. I'm really excited.
Could you just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of your background, let people know where you're coming from, and then we'll jump into the topic?
Outstanding. Yeah. So my background is actually primarily from the defense microelectronics activity. I was there for about 10 years, and I was their first and only chief strategist. While I was there, covered a wide range of items. The organization is primarily focused on microelectronic related items that benefit the Defense Department, and then by extension, other portions of the government. Everything from the intelligence community, the Department of Energy, and now more recently with the Department of Commerce playing a larger role. So with that integration, things like secure electronics through DMEA's Trust Accreditation Program is something I'm extremely familiar with and help to work within that program. I mean, we even helped support a number of different very state-of-the-art secure vulnerabilities, working with agencies like DARPA, for example, in buying down risk for the Defense Department. And, a couple other aspects within DMEA, they have a full-fledged foundry capability, which is a low mix, high volume. So the way to think about it is, since the Defense Department is such a small purchaser of microelectronics, it doesn't follow a commercial model. What it does is it follows a defense model. So with that kind of being the motivation behind the fab that's there, that was one of the key pillars of the organization. And there was a variety of other things that were encompassed there. But with the role that I had at DMEA, there was not only the technical aspect, but a huge policy aspect that helped to drive a lot of different things like DoD instructions, for example, as well as requirements into the FAR. So anything that was acquisition based. So there was quite a bit of spread as it relates to not only the capabilities that were there and that are currently there, but also the impact that we had across the entire government.
Okay, great. Well, this is going to be a terrific conversation. Obviously, you have the breadth of knowledge, not just technically, but organizationally, so that we can really talk about how these things fit together. But let's go ahead and take an enormous macro look, if you will, and discuss what is a chip. People like to talk about chips all the time, but let's get really specific about what we're talking about. We'll talk a little bit about where they came from and what the types are, and then we can start talking about how they're made, because all of that fits together in what we need to look at as far as how they're going to interact in potential conflict.
Yeah, so you'll see me today use the term microelectronics and semiconductor almost interchangeably. But to get to the point of where we understand where that actually is defined, let's start kind of working our way down. So when I talk about microelectronics or semiconductor devices, think about electronics and how electronics operates for a variety of different things, everything from your cell phone to your computer. Anything that has an electronic requirement is where these components or these chips are integrated into to allow the functions to happen for whatever type of application there are. So taking it a level down below that, when electronics are described, it's typically an aggregate of a variety of different chips that are operating in tandem to create a specific type of end use. So within those specific components, you have the microelectronic chips. Now, these chips are made up of a variety of different types, everything from memory devices to digital logic to analog mixed signal devices to microcontrollers, microprocessors. All of those have unique functions that allow for these electronics to go ahead and perform the operations they need, like for your computer, like I said, or your cell phone. They'll have just different microchips performing different functions to enable them to do what their end use is. Now, boiling it down from the actual chips, you have items known as transistors. Now, these transistors operate, as many of us have heard the example of ones and zeros or switches. Now, not much can happen with a single switch, right? I mean, you have your light switch at your house, you turn it on, one single function happens, you turn it off, another single function happens, and that's about it. But when you start to aggregate multiple switches in, now something interesting happens. And the example I like to use with this is during the holidays, which just recently happened. Many people will go around and look at, different lights that people put up. And every once in a while, there'll be a home that has kind of this orchestrated network of lights. And they all function with music and all these different types of things. But at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of on-off switches. But it gives a performance that people can go ahead and absorb. Oh, wow, I can relate to that song. Or let me look over here and this tree is dancing or whatever it may be. Now, that's hundreds of lights. If you start thinking about where we are today with billions of transistors, now it gets extremely interesting because now these chips can perform very complicated items that are needed for the electronics to go and do their operation. Even so much so now, as a state of the art with AI generated images and the such, the computing power associated with this is billions upon billions of transistors all working together to create one single output that the end user has. So kind of summarizing this, you have a bunch of switches that are all integrated together into a chip. And these chips have a variety of different flavors associated with them. Memory, microcontrollers, microprocessors, etc., that work on an electronic network or an electronic board that ultimately help to drive a specific end use for the application, whether it be a computer, a cell phone. I mean, even washing machines today have, electronic components in them. So that's the background around, when I talk about during this podcast, microelectronics, semiconductor devices, and, the chips associated with them.
Okay, great. I appreciate the analogy. I'm a big fan of analogy. Listeners of the show know, and I think it helps the layperson to really relate to what you're talking about. Because at the end of the day, that single light switch in our house is a distant cousin of the F-35 in a way, and everything that it can do, right?
100%. Yeah.
Okay. So we didn't just get here, right? We didn't just wake up one morning from a vacuum tube world and get here. So in short, what are the big advances that we've seen to get us to where we are today in what is, obviously unprecedented as we move forward in technology? It's always unprecedented unless you have a horrible step backwards. But in brief, how did we get here?
There's a lot of different items that help to create a microelectronic device, but the one that I'd say has been the critical piece associated with where we started out with, these simplistic switches to highly integrated chips that are performing, like I said, AI functions and the such, has to go down specifically towards lithography. Now, lithography is one of the major process steps in creating a microelectronic device. If you back in high school or junior high had to take a photography course and you had a dark room and you had to go and create a picture from something that you took out while you were walking around for the class, right? You'd go in that dark room, you'd have your negative, you'd shine light through there, and then on the photosensitive paper, you would be able to have your image projected onto there. Same kind of philosophy happens with microelectronic devices. However, it is highly tuned into a very specific region that allows for all of these chips to be created. Now, they've gone past just the ultraviolet light that is needed for creating these devices into something that is known now as extreme ultraviolet lithography. That advancement right there took us into an area that no one had foreseen as it relates to electronic components. And with the EUV capability, it took the industry away from just planar devices where you're just printing, electronic components on a flat surface to now integrating them into where we're at today, which is 3D stacked. And that, I'd say right there, was one of the inflection points that was highly critical for microelectronics. Without that kind of advancement, it would have been a huge challenge, not only to keep up with the node scaling, also referred to as Moore's Law, but also, creating the compute power that's needed for things that we're using on a daily basis today.
So the extreme ultraviolet, is it purely a function of how small the waveform is that allows us to create a more complex chip? Or is it something else about the characteristic of the extreme UV versus UV?
Oh, you're 100% correct. It's the wavelengths associated with it that is highly tuned to, the lithography process that is there. And in order to do so, the machines associated with this are exponentially more expensive than the lithography tools that we're using, just normal ultraviolet light. There's only a few in the United States. I believe there's less than 10. But I mean, it's such a pillar of capability that with the recent CHIPS initiative that was pushed forward as part of Section 9906, which was the R&D function associated with it, they created a center of excellence focused on EUV applications, which is up in New York. So it's not only a critical piece for the overall manufacturing process, but it is actually turned into something national importance to make investments in and have, the ability to manufacture state of the art here in the United States. So it is one of the things that is going to carry us into the next phase of electronic manufacturing.
And it's a Dutch company or Dutch technology, right? That has the lithography technology. Is my background check right?
Yep. ASML is the company that manufactures the tools that are needed for this.
Elaborating on where these chips are made, and we can sort of talk about the lithography technology, the quantum leap in what this means and how rare they are.
Absolutely. So there is an entire supply chain that is spread across the entire world. There are centers of excellence or capabilities. Let's not call it centers of excellence. Let's call it capabilities that are dominated in certain regions. The United States still has a very strong capability in our design portion of the supply chain. That is something where companies like Synopsys, Cadence, they play a major role in the design aspect associated with devices. But as you start moving along the time scale, those designs ultimately have to get fabricated. Now, most of the fabrication was originally done here in the United States, but has migrated over to, I'd say, Southeast Asia as the predominant place, Taiwan being the major manufacturer for most logic devices. And I'll create a little separation here with where the manufacturing is. Logic, mostly done, like I said, in Taiwan. The major company associated with that is a company called TSMC. The other region of the world that produces electronic components in high volumes is the memory devices. And those memory devices are primarily made in South Korea. Two companies, SK Hynix and Samsung, are the major manufacturers there. But it is, outside of the United States. Now, we do have capabilities here in the United States that help to rival some of the volume of manufacturing over in those two locations, with Micron being the predominant one here in the United States for memory, and for logic, Intel, which many of us are very familiar with. So that's, to answer your question, the kind of the two locations where majority of the electronic components are made. And when I say majority, it's not like a 51%. In the example of TSMC, we're talking about 98 to 99% of logic components are coming out of there that service the entire world's demand. So it is not a slight lead that they have. It is a major lead that they have in that space.
Okay, let's drill down on that just a little bit, because this lithography technology is unique, right? It comes out from a single company. Technology is Dutch, as you and I spoke about earlier. So how involved is the process? And where I'm going with the question is, we all understand the international challenges around Taiwan, China, the way that commerce could be affected by any sort of conflict. The U.S. has a rich history of being able to tool up when it needed to change from up one consumer good to a manufactured war material good. What is the actual chip process, especially when we start to talk about the EUV technology? How hard is that to transition, both in terms of infrastructure and training a workforce?
No, that's an excellent question. And it comes with a rather lengthy answer. So the supply chain associated with developing a electronic component or microelectronic component is kind of simplistically broken down into the following categories. You have your design, and you aggregate those designs into a layout that will ultimately be fabricated. Now, the fabrication piece cannot happen without a mask manufacturer creating those, masks that I was describing earlier, like with the photo lab. Same kind of process. You have your mask manufacturer and your fabrication facility. Once those are done, your wafer, your semiconductor wafer, is then post-processed, which means that it is diced up and cut up into little small chips. Those chips are then packaged, and then those packaged devices are then distributed out to be integrated into electronic boards. So that is the overall supply chain associated with developing an electronic component. But more specifically, you're asking the question of the actual fabrication piece and the manufacturing of this, and how hard is it to just take that capability and drop it in somewhere else? The answer to that is it depends. It depends on what technology you're developing or trying to fabricate and the complexity associated with it. So in certain situations, there are things like power devices, which don't really have a lot of transistors in there that are switching on and off, but they're highly tuned into a power capability. And that comes into a separate discussion of materials and sourcing those materials and the such. But as you start going in the logic space and you start looking at state-of-the-art logic, this is why there's such an emphasis associated with this. It becomes extremely challenging, to the point where there is only a handful of experts that actually know how to operate a EUV tool. So finding the talent associated with that is extremely rare. Why the United States is making investments in an EUV center of excellence, because being able to learn and then train people to do that is something that is typically focused around a very small set of investments, because there's only a few companies that do these kinds of things. Now, we are heavily reliant on TSMC for the second item that you described, which is the customer base, right? How can we just take the customers, or can we take the customers from TSMC and let's say transfer them over to Intel or transfer them over to something that is domestic? The problem with this is that every customer is qualified to the unique processes at a fabrication facility. So though they may all make the same kind of logic, the subtle details associated with the actual fabrication is enough to make it so that when Apple is qualified at TSMC, they cannot just take their design and move it over to Intel. There's just process variances that are impactful enough that would cost millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to transfer over. So it's kind of a two-part piece. We as a country are going to move our product to the United States for manufacturing. What are our options? Option one is subsidize some of these end suppliers hundreds of millions of dollars, or tell them to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, only doing it, with the United States capabilities. Maybe, maybe not. The second thing is to convince companies that are overseas to manufacture here in the United States. One of the major steps that happened with the CHIPS initiative. Or third, we just understand that there's going to be, a Peter principle that's going to happen, and you just don't manufacture there. So it's a really challenging set of questions. But to elaborate on one of your topics, the workforce is the most critical piece. Though it is very expensive to design and manufacture these items, if you do not have the expertise associated with operating a state-of-the-art fab, there is no chance in being able to execute. Even though they're highly automated, the workforce that is required to support all of the ecosystem is something that is a current challenge within the United States.
So if we look back to a historical analogy, maybe one of the, if not the biggest move of a logistics supply chain in history in context of a military campaign would be the Soviets moving so much of their production capability east behind the Urals in front of the advancing German armies in 1941. So if we were faced with a situation similar in that Taiwan was at risk, or even the trade lines from Taiwan were at risk, this is less a months-long endeavor. This might actually be a generational endeavor. And is that fair to say that the amount of infrastructure buildup, the amount of societal education that would have to happen to create this force, this is not going to happen in a matter of months on a tactical scale? This is a strategic decision that would have to be made.
The 1,000%. And that's why there's so much emphasis around how the United States handles a situation if Taiwan was to be impacted in some way, shape, or form in distributing their electronic components.
So with that, what does the global supply chain look like in terms of both throughput, stored throughput, if you will, and elasticity? So if I turn the switch off today on anything that is not already manufactured in transit, what does the normal consumer consumption of basically the United States and Western Europe look like in terms of how hand to mouth is that supply chain?
So the best example I can give to this is look back at the COVID pandemic and the impact that had on worldwide supply. It impacted the semiconductor market substantially, where people were not able to get, a Ford F-150 because they couldn't get the 30-cent components for specific items that are needed in those types of trucks. So it would put the world at a halt if there was a lack of supply from Taiwan, because many of the companies that use them would not have a secondary source for qualification. So there would not be an ability to distribute things out. So everything from telecommunication to data centers to, national security would be impacted, which is why there is so many questions around what would happen if there was a loss of supply and how would we react if it was a short-term item, long-term item, kinetic, non-kinetic, and everything in between. Because trying to plan around something like that is extreme fear that I believe not only the nation could potentially face, but if not positioned correctly, could be in a scenario that we are not ready to handle the impact that is happening in that scenario.
So looking back on the COVID pandemic and that impact, it was weeks to months, I think, depending on the field where we really started to feel the impact. And that was purely because of supply chain issues, not because we were worried the whole source was at risk. So one can only imagine that that would accelerate, especially when you look at the reality that this sort of scenario would include combat losses, war losses, and everyone who is part of the supply chain and the manufacturing chain is going to be very aware that they are now in possession of a commodity whose value has just become astronomical. Would it be unfair of me to say that as carbon is to life as we understand it, so are these microelectronics to modern industrialized society?
I think you hit the nail right on the head. So let me explain why. Microelectronic devices are an enabling technology. And what I mean by that is that it's foundational. Every other technology that is out there requires electronics. Everything from telecommunications to AI, the two examples I used earlier. But let's use a defense related application, hypersonics, for example. Those require electronic components to be integrated in to their end systems. So now you have this spectrum of technologies that have, electronics readily available today and are expecting them to be what not only allows them to operate, but enhances their capabilities. That spigot gets turned off, and every technology that is enabled by microelectronics, which I'm hell bent to find one that really isn't, is going to have a drastic impact associated with not only its forward momentum, but also its current operation or its sustainment associated with it.
Okay. So really, it's impossible to overstate the impact that this would happen. So I appreciate your inputs there because I think you've made it really clear that there is no real substitute, right? Historically, as Western society in conflict, we've always found a way to make do, or at least for a little while, to make do with the absence of a material when we've been faced with kinetic conflict. This is an entire underpinning of everything we do. And we've based the Western way of war, at least the American way of war, on these high-tech systems. To the point, for example, in my personal background as a surface warfare officer, I don't know that we could navigate a fleet by the stars and by sunlines with Sextant anymore. And even if we can't employ our weapons the way we would. It fundamentally changes everything. And as we think about China and their three island chain theory and how we talk about their Navy, for example, a lot of people like to point out that the vast majority of Chinese PLA Navy ships are regional. They're not blue water ships like we have. Well, if you eliminate the American and Western capability to use long range precision fires to navigate over long distances, then we're fighting in somebody else's backyard with essentially World War II-ish technology that we haven't used in 60 years and are very rusty on, to say the least.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to navigate a aircraft carrier with a sunstone. It puts us at a complete disadvantage. And one of the scenarios that has to be considered. I mean, let's go out and talk about kind of the elephant in the room. The Chinese are the ones that are hinting at a potential takeover of Taiwan. And if they are able to acquire the assets associated with TSMC, which would be a one potential scenario of a spectrum of scenarios that could ultimately happen, that would be a crippling item for the world and an enabling one for the Chinese. And they know this. This is why Taiwan has leveraged the fact of what is known as the Silicon Shield as a way to be protected to date from, really any kind of kinetic type of item. But like I said, it's one scenario in a vast spectrum of scenarios, and it's impossible to tell which of the scenarios may roll out.
Yeah, I think as an operational planner in my background, you try and find the commonalities in those vast number of scenarios. And I think the interruption in the flow of chips, for whatever reason, it can be interdiction of transportation. We haven't even really talked about that. We don't need to talk about it at length, but individual chips are obviously very small. They're very light, but you have to talk about mass more so. The volume of these things is such that there is no way that air transport, even if we harnessed all of the world's air transport, could make up for the way that these are shipped. Is that correct?
100%. And we're describing a set of items, which is another critical piece, right? Air transport. Let's peel that onion just a little bit.
Good point.
We've talked a lot about state-of-the-art components, but with the variety of different air platforms that are out there, and specifically the defense air platforms that are out there, they have a high mix of technology requirements at very low volumes that are extremely dated. So let's take, for example, the B-52, right? It is a system that will have, at the end of its service life, have served the United States government for over 100 years. If you think of the original electronic components that were required to operate that system, they are not commercially in high demand. So those kinds of situations also emerge as it relates to not only maintaining or sustaining our current air platforms that are out there, but also how do we take what is commercially available and implement that as well. So this is one of the other aspects of microelectronic fabrication that has been a huge investment by the Chinese. They have been heavily focused on legacy and something known as state of the practice technology items, which you don't really find many domestic solutions for. Now, there are a handful of capabilities that are out there, but in a situation where we had to sustain a lot of the different aircraft that we have that are out there in, let's say, a combat scenario, and we were having to, either fix aircraft in their meantime between repair type of thing as they're operating, in a quick fashion, we hit another set of challenges in the microelectronic space. So a conflict, in the Indo-Pacific region that is requiring a lot of our resources is going to have kind of, multiple tiers of impacts, not only access to stuff that we need today, but also the sustainment in operating a long-term type of conflict that the United States, hopefully does not have to endure.
So let's set aside for a moment the supply chain, the availability of chips. Pretty robust discussion here that it is a relatively fragile supply chain, and it is a absolutely critical component for everything we do. Setting that aside for a moment, there's also a lot of, I'll call it potentially urban legend and speculation about what can and cannot be done by an actor. And, I'd say a bad actor, but it's all a matter of perspective, right? But, an actor with evil intent towards the United States to impact operations of our gear through existing chips in our existing systems that were produced in that other country, in China or some other country. How much of that is fact? How much of that is urban legend? And let's start to take a dive into what is and is not possible when it comes to almost a Trojan horse intrusion into our electronics.
So there are, known instances of having the ability to impact the functionality of electronic devices. There are a spectrum of scenarios that exist within that. The kill switch is the obvious one, right? Today it works, tomorrow it doesn't. The question that I've been involved with a very small community on is what about the items that you don't see, the ones that are hidden in plain sight, right? A kill switch could easily be detected if there's, some kind of test methodology that is looking for something like that. But what about things that propose latent defects? And ultimately, the chip operates for 4 years, 5 years. But for some of those long-term sustainment missions, think space applications. A satellite does not go up for a year or two. It goes up for 15, 20, 25 years. If there is a latent defect in there and there is just a, group watching to wait until something isn't working, and then they know that, okay, X capability is going to no longer be available, then that is another set of concerns. So if you look down to the semiconductor physics that is used to create any kind of electronic device, there are, known both reliability challenges associated with chip components, as well as there are design vulnerabilities associated with this. Now, when we start talking very specific on this starts getting into, kind of the secret sauce of the items that the government knows, doesn't know, all that kind of stuff. But what I can say is that there is a reality associated with nefarious people going in, having knowledge of how to create these kinds of components, and let's just say muddling with them. So that way the intended end use is impacted by the way they kind of played around with the devices.
Okay, fair enough. And we've always made a point on this show of not wanting to breach OPSEC or operational security. So I appreciate the nuance of your answer there. One thing in this discussion of the Trojan horse, if you will. So you alluded earlier to the primary centers for manufacturing the logic and the memory storage being Taiwan and South Korea. And clearly we believe that both of those countries are allies, and we have no reason to doubt that, have no reason to doubt their security any more or less than we would doubt our own security. But as you've described, we have such a system of systems now. Is there a good look? We've probably all seen the charts online that show how a Tomahawk missile or an SM-2 has to track this complicated DNA, and oh my gosh, everything's coming from China. Is that accurate, or is that an application of a consumer goods paradigm onto military tech?
I think you're describing kind of an OV chart or something like that would have, all these different pieces kind of operating in tandem and the such. The challenge with many of the, let's use the specific military example. The challenge with all military systems goes to, one of the big problems that people have been advocating for a solution with acquisition reform, the acquisition system associated with it. So the United States government doesn't buy chips. That is kind of a false view of how the Defense Department operates. They buy systems. They buy a Tomahawk missile. They buy an F-35. That's what they buy. Where do they buy it from? They buy it from the primes. What the primes do is they are then tasked to go build these systems. And they will go and then work either directly with the OEMs or a variety of suppliers or M-tier suppliers. So through that entire portion of the acquisition process, electronic components, these microelectronic devices are purchased. So the way that these things are purchased, going back to the acquisition requirements, is best low cost, right? That is the way that things operate. Now, unless there is a specific requirement associated with the origin of these devices, that starts to pose a problem of where the original manufacturing site is. The second challenge associated with this is the number of distributors that are involved in this. Not all of them will be screening for the types of devices, whether it be things that have these nefarious types of items integrated into them, whether it be the location of the OEM, whether it be counterfeit components. All of these items start to become major questions associated with where these chips are being bought. Now, I will say that, the industry as a whole has gotten smarter on this, but we're talking about millions of components that are being purchased for thousands of systems that are out there. And there is not a centralized location to point to that says, here is the list of all the chips that are purchased by the United States government for X, Y, and Z. So there starts to become more questions around the pedigree of the devices, the security of those devices, and the such. So it starts to become a larger set of questions that comes out on, the major problem, which is how the acquisition process happens, which is one of the big vulnerabilities in not only securing the electronics that are coming into the end systems, but also ensuring that they are the type, the quality, et cetera, of the microelectronic devices that are needed for operation.
That's very insightful, and I appreciate that, because I think it's very easy for people who want to gain views on social media or want to make sure that their editorial comment is seen to sort of highlight the worst case scenario. And I think that's an excellent point you bring up, that this is such an intricate process that it's not a simple question, so it's not a simple solution. And the thing that occurred to me as you were describing all that, because with my background, I'm always looking at the worst case scenario, right? That's what people involved in force protection do. But it sounds like I don't want to say opportunity, but one facet that is more of a positive is there are so many of these chips being made for so many different things, or microelectronics being made. It would also take a Herculean effort on the part of a nefarious actor to somehow make sure that the chips they were compromising made it into the end unit that they really wanted it to, unless it was a very specific type of technology, correct?
Or if there was a state actor involved that was pulling together multiple resources to have one intended end use, right? I mean, hypothetical scenarios, right?
Right. Okay. So there's vulnerabilities, there's lower vulnerabilities, but in the end, the acquisition vulnerability, but it's improving. We're aware of it and we're working on it. This is all new technology.
Yeah, there's a few guidance requirements that help buy down risk. One of the specifics is the DoD instruction, DoDI 5200.44, that helps out with different type of application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs, and how they are purchased for specific end uses. But it doesn't cover the entire microelectronic spectrum of chips. So as ASIC-specific requirements under that DoD instruction, doesn't expand out to memory devices, microcontrollers, field programmable gate arrays. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of types of devices it does not.
So then, sort of coming, if not full circle, then rounding out the potential vulnerabilities, we've talked about microelectronics that could be compromised to deny or degrade operations, that could simply cause immediate or long-term malfunction. Is there an opportunity for these chips to actually help create a backdoor into other systems? And I say that because, the greatest espionage weapon that any actor can have is not to compromise one thing, but to get inside the decision matrix of his opponent. So is that a vulnerability that is possible here, that these things could have a piggybacked role that has nothing to do with their actual point of operation? Or is that a construct of the high-tech novelist, if you will?
So I think that there's a lot of reality with what you call the high-tech novelist. I call it the tinfoil hat. There's a lot of reality to the potential sets of scenarios that could happen and how these chips can be functioning, latent type of operations that turn on, sensing, detecting. I mean, there's a variety of different applications. So I would say that if you think long and hard about, potential scenarios, there are, camps of people that have spent their life trying to not only create that specific application, but also ways to integrate it in. And I'd use that generalized example as a way to answer your question.
Fair enough. So what haven't we discussed that you think is a critical facet of microelectronics, specifically as it relates to potential peer conflict, either in the supply chain or the implementation in the military sphere?
So the one item that we haven't talked about yet is, and it was kind of the lead in for our, initial meet and greet, was, the assessment in the Indo-Pacific region, a conflict, a set of conflicts, what that may look like. And there's a variety of different things that are going on in this space. I mean, the United States is very active in, evaluating, what happens if China invades Taiwan. And, there's been a number of kinetic evaluations, war games associated with this, what is the counter move to their move, et cetera. But I would say that an area that is not as heavily looked at, except for there was some original evaluations by the Office of Net Assessment, is looking at a non-kinetic type of scenario where not a single round is fired, no missiles are launched, but there is a set of technological related conflicts that occur that put Taiwan in a jeopardized situation. And I would say that that is something that I would be a humongous advocate for the new leadership with the new administration coming in today, taking a look at more deeply. Because if Taiwan is protecting itself with a technology shield or the silicon shield, then why would a attack not happen in a technology fashion that is crippling and hidden in plain sight. I would say that that is a topic that we haven't discussed, and I think that needs to be a topic of more discussion, not only amongst friends and such, but also in the walls of all portions of the government, to be ready to not only have the assessments, but also have the contingency plans associated with them. So if there is a loss of access, a nefarious type of thing that happens, a conflict that is completely technologically focused, that there is the same level of investment in evaluation as we put into kinetic war game style types of evaluations.
Very well put. I appreciate you bringing that up because what have we always seen in the history of conflict is that more often than not, the actor who can innovate either is the victor or the person who can best elaborate on their innovation. So that's a great point. Are we isolating ourselves behind technological Maginot lines, not realizing that the technology has taken a step or the nature of future conflict is taking a step that is just going to not literally, but figuratively outflank our defenses. So that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a lot to think about. We could probably do an entire whole other episode on that alone. So I appreciate the time you've taken with us today, Daniel. Just to sort of recap what we've talked about, just stop me where I'm wrong here. Microelectronics are very, very complex. The infrastructure to make them is bordering on maybe not unique, but very individual. It is very high tech, and it is something that is a generational transition, not a matter of weeks or months transition to build into one's economy.
Absolutely.
And there are so many interconnected pieces of this supply chain that in our current world, it would almost be impossible to bring all of them into one country's domain.
100% correct. It will take a collection of countries all working together to help buy down risk seen by the United States.
Okay. And then lastly, there are very real vulnerabilities even in the chips that we already have to varying degrees. And those vulnerabilities are recognized. I don't want to say they're known because that implies you recognize every single individual vulnerability. I think that's unreasonable to ask of any actor, any defense organization. But we know, and we are working to get better at it, but we still have that concern out there. So I guess that leaves us with the question of, what do we do? And that's not something we're going to try and answer here, but that's the thought-provoking question we hope to ask for the listener with series like this. So we've given this all to you, listener. What do we do? Where do we go with this as a country who is almost entirely dependent on microelectronics for our defense capability? I know my infantry friends would disagree that it's a man and a woman on the ground with a rifle, and they're not wrong, but everything that goes into leveraging that man or woman on the ground is based on these microelectronics. So that's the question I would leave the listener with. Daniel, closing thoughts. I appreciate your time. What's your take on the challenge we see?
So I think that if you try and digest all of the conversation we had today, you can start to feel like Atlas. And it is a very heavy topic with a lot of terms that are not used on a daily basis. Ultraviolet light, nanometer, lithography. These are terms that the common person does not use at a dinner party or, when you're out on your day-to-day life. But where I would say the important piece in kind of wrapping your head around all of this type of stuff is starting to socialize the general topics, just like we do with, computer malware, right? It's something that we all talk about. I've never programmed any kind of malware or any kind of, cybersecurity related item, but I know my computer needs it because it's a vulnerability, right? And now we know, okay, we have to go and look at, all these different protection mechanisms for our computer. Don't have to be an expert, but we know in the back of our head, probably something I should be concerned with. and I just need to know enough so I'm protected, or at least I have situational awareness. Same thing with microelectronics. I think it turns into a topic that should not be, a foreign item that people are so not only concerned with, but that the learning curve is going to be too steep in trying to understand. Talking about electronic components and understanding that Taiwan has an impact, South Korea has an impact. It's a worldwide collection of things. I think when more conversation around the generalities associated with this occur, then it'll inspire people that are interested in the space, people learning in the space, and then the decision makers that have the ability to influence change, direct their focus in specific areas that help drive the nation in a specific area. So I would say that conversation is kind of the net takeaway I would have in summary of what we're doing today. Not everyone has to be a world expert, but everyone can play a role in some way, shape, or form in buying down the United States risk in microelectronic availability, sustainability, and security.
All right. I love what you just said, and I want to say something and see if I am taking this away correctly, but I still want you to have the last word if you want it, so I'll let you say something right after that. What really struck me in what you just said, for the latter half at least of the 20th century, probably a little bit more, and the entirety to date of the 21st century, everyone has perceived access to oil as the critical component to national success. And we didn't until recently talk about what if we don't have oil, and that's a whole other conversation about, right, what does a world without oil look like? But no one ever said, well, okay, if our oil supplies are cut off, we're going to figure out how to make sail power and steam power work again. If I'm hearing you right, we need to have that sort of societal discussion around microelectronics. Not, oh, what if that were to happen? But this has got to be a key facet of international relations, is that maybe the Strait of Malacca and the Pacific and choke points within the Pacific are the new Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz for technology. And everyone needs to understand and at least have that working knowledge over the dinner table after no one listens to I shouldn't say no one, my apologies to the networks, but it's not like it was gathered around, to watch the evening news. You get it from wherever you get, and then you discuss it over the table or you get text about it. You're saying that's where we need to be on microelectronics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a realist. I doubt that it'll consume 4 or 5 hours of people's, discussions. But I will say that we are seeing a pendulum shift with things like the CHIPS initiative, where now there are policymakers, people in the Defense Department talking about microelectronics in a lot more frequency than they have ever done historically. We take that momentum as a nation and continue to discuss these topics and how it impacts every facet of our life. And I think that being comfortable in having this kind of dialogue is going to be a critical piece that will influence everything from national security to workforce development to policy making. There is a spectrum of items that it can ultimately happen. And it just takes small discussions, asking questions about this, and ensuring that we have enough of a working knowledge to know where our successes are and, more importantly, where our vulnerabilities are.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Daniel, I really appreciate the time you've taken with us. I think this will shed a lot of light for people following the series. And I hope, like many other things in the series, it will become a subject of discussion in places that really matter, because we know we've had that impact so far, and we hope we do moving ahead. You've been a great guest, and I thank you.
Hey, Scott, thanks a bunch. It was outstanding being here, and I look forward to, chatting, a few more times down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us here on Future War. And thank you to Daniel. There's a lot of what we in the military would call myth, legend, and lore around microelectronics. And I hope today's discussion has sparked an interest for you to dive deeper. You can start with the TSS microchip primer Daniel mentioned, which is linked in the show notes below. I believe Daniel's last point is a crucial one. We must start thinking about microelectronics as part of everyday discussions of national security. For our modern world, and particularly our military, is as dependent upon them as previous militaries were upon steel, gunpowder, and oil. We'll be back next time with episode 11, diving into artificial intelligence and machine learning. If you've enjoyed this program, you can find additional commentary, interviews, and in-depth series on current affairs in military aviation at Authentic Media on YouTube or on your podcast provider of choice. On Future War is brought to you through partnership with Cubic Defense. For over 50 years, Cubic has been facilitating warfighter readiness to prevail on Night 1 and beyond.